Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely Met webinar. 2 weeks ago at the Munich Security Forum, Vice President Kamala Harris said, quote, "There cannot be, in my opinion, peace and security for the people of Israel or the people of Gaza without a two-state solution, and we cannot give up on that." Set against the backdrop of the worst single day the Jewish people have experienced since the Holocaust, October 7th, and against the backdrop of the Shikaki polls that indicate widespread support for Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in favor of the atrocities of October 7th by the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, the Biden administration continues to push for a two-state solution. We have all been to this movie before. The administration has spoken about rewarding the violence that we've just witnessed with the creation of a contiguous Palestinian state stretching from Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, through Gaza. The dusting off of this solution, which has been tried and failed many, many times throughout history, stretches back to the 1937 Peel Commission, the 1947 UN Partition Plan, the 1967 Khartoum Conference, the Oslo Accords of 1993, the Roadmap for Peace in 2002, the Gaza Withdrawal of 2005, and the even more generous offer of Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to Mahmoud Abbas in September of 2008 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We are very privileged to be able to have with us today our wonderful friend, Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who, among other things, was a former Minister of Congressional Affairs at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the former Consul General at the Israeli Consulate for the Southwestern United States. Yoram is well known in both the Knesset and the halls of Congress, and appears very frequently in American and Israeli visual and print media. So Yoram will explain to us, first of all, why do you think successive administrations keep returning to the same old failed paradigm?
Well, thank you very much. I would like to start with a story from the old days of the Roman Empire, when they used to throw men to the arena to fight lions. And one of those poor human beings was thrown to the arena. He has a sword in his hand, but he knows he stands no chance against the lion, and he decided to kneel down and pray. And he knelt down, covered his eyes with his hands, and he heard the crowd yelling, "Blood, blood, blood." He heard the dungeon gates open. He heard the lion roaming towards him. And then there is absolute silence. And at first, he assumed that that's the sound of death. He's dead. But then he realized if he can reflect, he must be alive. So he gathered some courage, opened one eye, and he got astounded. The lion was lying about 3 feet away from him, covering its eyes with its paws. And the human being, the poor human being, was thinking, it worked. And he said, "Psst, psst, lion, are you also praying?" And the lion said, "Absolutely, I'm saying grace." And in my mind, this is very similar to the attitude of the State Department towards the Middle East in general and the Palestinian issue in particular, not realizing the difference between genuine goodwill type of prayer and saying grace, not realizing that in the Middle East especially, but I assume throughout the world, rogue elements, terrorists, do bite the hand that feeds them. And when it comes to the State Department's proposal, which is a few decades old proposal to establish a Palestinian state, I think we first should pay attention to the credibility of any proposal emanating from the State Department. If we go back to 1978-79, it was the State Department that led the US policy of stabbing the back of the Shah of Iran, the American policeman of the Gulf, and providing tailwind to Ayatollah Khomeini, courting Ayatollah Khomeini into Tehran, persuading the Iranian military, which opposed Khomeini, to refrain from any opposition because, according to the State Department, Ayatollah Khomeini was supposed to become an Iranian edition of Gandhi, preoccupied with tractors rather than with tanks. We saw the State Department vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein until the day of the invasion of Kuwait, August of 1990. The State Department considered Saddam to be an ally because, after all, according to the State Department's simplistic worldview, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And therefore, if Saddam is enemy of Iran and Iran became enemy of the US, wouldn't Saddam be a friend? Never occurred to them that it could be that the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. And in fact, about 10 days before the invasion, when Saddam met with the State Department representatives, the US ambassador to Baghdad, April Gillespie, and asked her, what would the US reaction be if Iraq were to invade its province 19, that's how Iraq refers to Kuwait, returning it to the motherland. The response by April Gillespie, who represented the worldview of the State Department, and particularly at that time Secretary of State Jim Baker, the response was, this is none of our business. It's an inter-Arab issue, and I don't know any greener light than that type of green light accorded by the State Department to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And I can only assume how bewildered Saddam was when suddenly the US launched a military operation against him after giving him a State Department type of green light. We have seen the State Department reaction to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, when in 2009, 2010, and 11, they literally stabbed the back of the pro-US Mubarak, providing tailwind to the Muslim Brotherhood to take over power in Egypt. And it was only General Sisi who put an end to the rule of that anti-US, anti-Western, anti-Saudi, anti-Morocco, anti-any pro-Arab, pro-US Arab entity in the Middle East. Once again, it was General Sisi who saved the day of Egypt from the intended mal-thought policy in Egypt. And certainly 2011, State Department at that time, headed by Hillary Clinton, initiated the US-led NATO military offensive against Gaddafi of Libya. And the reason was that Gaddafi violated human rights fighting his opposition, escaped the mind of the State Department that Gaddafi was fighting Islamic terrorists. And in the Middle East, you don't respect human rights when you fight terrorists. And the US has no choice between pro-US Arab countries who respect human rights and pro-US Arab countries who violate human rights. The choice is between pro-US Arab countries which violate human rights or anti-US Arab countries which violate human rights. And we know the outcome was that, has been that Libya has become a lawless, chaotic country, an arena for a number of anti-US Islamic terrorists, an arena for ongoing civil war until this very day, with the involvement of Russia and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE and Greece and Turkey and France, etc. And then certainly we know the reaction by the State Department to the turbulence on the Arab Street, which reached a new level at the end of 2010, referring to it the Arab Spring. And I haven't detected anything which reminds one of spring. It has been all along. Arab tsunami, but not in accordance with the worldview of the State Department, which is very anxious to substitute the real Middle East with an alternative reality, which presents a much more accommodating, much less violent and intolerant Middle East. And the same thing applies to the issue of the proposed Palestinian state. We hear often Secretary of State Blinken talking about Palestinian state. He has adhered to such a proposal going back to his days as staff director in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, hasn't changed his mind since then, determined to subordinate Middle East reality to his own virtual alternative reality. But the very interesting, intriguing element which we should pay attention to is that while Secretary of State Blinken and the entire Middle East establishment adheres to the concept of a proposed Palestinian state as a step towards supposedly Middle East stabilization, Middle East peace, security for Israel, and talking about two states peacefully coexisting side by side. And hardly anybody asks the State Department, please provide us the background which substantiate your assumption that here we're going to have two states peacefully coexisting side by side. It's a great vision. It's a highly sought after vision. But the question is it backed by reality or by alternative reality, by wishful thinking? And what is striking is that all pro-US Arab countries do not share such a vision, which is expressed by the Secretary of State, by the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and the entire State Department establishment. And the question is, what do you mean they don't support? After all, we keep hearing almost every day statements made by Arab leaders, by Arab foreign ministers, that they demand Israel to accept a Palestinian state. The Saudi foreign minister reiterates the notion that a prerequisite for normalization of ties between the Saudis and Israel is Israel's acceptance of the principle of a Palestinian state. But one small thing escapes the mind of many observers. This is the Arab talk. The question is, what is the Arab walk? And if there is a difference between the talk and the walk, obviously, the walk ranks much higher than the talk. And what we have seen in the Middle East for ages, in fact, since the appearance of Islam in the 7th century, is that on words one does not pay custom, and more than that, there is the tactic, some say even commandment, to resort to dissimulation, to taqiyya, when it comes to relationship between the so-called believers and the so-called infidels. And the question is, when the Arabs talk about Palestinian state, is that another form of dissimulation? And examining it, conducting due diligence of that talk, we find out that never, and I underline never, during Israel's conflicts with the Palestinians, we never witnessed any Arab country flexing its military, hardly financial muscles on behalf of the Palestinians. The current war is one of multitude of such confrontations. We didn't see when Israel fought the PLO in Lebanon. The war in Lebanon started in June of 1982. June went by, July went by, August, the PLO was expelled from Lebanon, and only then, in September, after the PLO expulsion from Lebanon, only then the Arab League decided to convene its leaders and talk about helping the PLO. Couldn't they find a day in June or in July or August before the PLO expulsion? Sure they could, but they did not want. They did not want to take the walk on behalf of the PLO. They had their share of talk, which obviously appeared in the headlines of the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, featured in MSNBC and CNN and the major networks, but was not expressed by Arab walk. In fact, not a single Arab-Israel war erupted because of the Palestinian issue or on behalf of the Palestinian issue. And going back to 1948-49 War of Independence, at the end of the war, Jordan occupied Judea and Samaria, naming it for the first time West Bank because it joined the East Bank of Jordan. And guess what? It never occurred to them to provide political rights to the Arabs in Judea and Samaria. In fact, they prohibited any political activity in Judea and Samaria. Egypt occupied Gaza during the 48-49 war. And once again, they did not allow any political activity. In fact, they declared a nightly curfew in Gaza to make sure that there is no political activity. The Arab League gave lip service when they established, after the 1948-49 war, the Palestinian Department, but by 1956, they simply eliminated that department to prove that when it comes to walk, they do not take the walk on behalf of the Palestinians. And certainly, only recently, during the current war, in November 11th, the Saudis hosted a joint session of Arab Summit and the Summit of the International Muslim countries. And during that joint Arab-Muslim summit, the Palestinians, along with Iran and Algeria, submitted the proposal to end all diplomatic, economic, touristic, and defense ties with Israel. That resolution was defeated by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and a number of non-Arab Muslim states. And once again, that was a walk, because if they would go along with that resolution, that would be quite a tailwind to the idea of the proposed Palestinian state, but this would be against their own interest, and the Arabs have been very clear. It never occurred to them to sacrifice their own interest on the altar of the Palestinians or Palestinian interest. And why? Why have the Arabs pursued that path? And it has to do again with a difference between the State Department on the one hand and every single pro-American Arab country on the other hand, namely the State Department, as usual, bases its policy on Palestinian proclamations, on Palestinian diplomatic announcements, on discussions, deliberations with Palestinians, which always reflect a pretty moderate Palestinian view. The Arabs don't care about the Palestinian talk. The Arabs are preoccupied with Palestinian walk. In other words, with Palestinian track record. Sadly, the track record is of little interest to the State Department because Middle East track record is pretty frustrating, sheds very somber light on the prospects of peace, and the State Department is determined to achieve peace right now, if possible, around the corner, at no cost. And again, therefore, the advancement of this virtual alternative reality, which is best advanced by focusing on talk. The State Department is focusing on speculative future scenarios rather than track record scenarios. Arabs, on the other hand, do not engage with speculative future scenarios. They do not give much credence to Palestinian talk. They highlight, they underscore the Palestinian walk, not vis-a-vis Israel, the Palestinian walk vis-a-vis fellow Arabs. And when it comes to examining the track record of Palestinians, they do not forget and they do not forgive the fact that in the early 1950s, when Egypt allowed the Palestinian leadership to terrorize Israel from Gaza, it took a year, 2 years before the Palestinians joined the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo and other parts of Egypt, terrorizing their own host country. And therefore, the Palestinian leadership had to run away from Egypt. Syria offered them asylum and allowed them to terrorize Israel. But within few years, they joined the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, terrorizing their own host government, and they had to run away from Syria. And it was Jordan that opened its arms, allowing the Palestinians to terrorize Israel from Jordan. But during 1970, the Palestinian leadership concluded, why only terrorize Israel? Why not try and take over Jordan? After all, 70% of Jordanians are Palestinians. Muslim Brotherhood is very well entrenched in Jordan. Why not take over what they perceive to be the eastern part of Palestine? Some 78% of British Mandate Palestine, and that triggered the Black September civil war, which forced the Palestinian leadership to run away to Lebanon. They plundered Lebanon from 1970 until 1982, when they have expelled from Lebanon. In the process, they triggered a number of civil wars in Lebanon. And in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, at a time when Kuwait was the most generous Arab host to Palestinians, all of whom were associates, relatives, friends of Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, namely PLO loyalists. It was those Palestinians who joined Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, stabbing their host in the back. Palestinians in Kuwait, in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, heralded Saddam Hussein, referring to him as the modern-day Salah ad-Din, the legendary Islamic warrior. And that was the reason for Sheikh Sabah of Kuwait, upon restoring power, complement of American resources, American blood and finance, the first thing he did was expelling almost all 400,000 Palestinians from Kuwait. And as I said, Arabs, unlike the State Department, do not forget, they do not forgive, and they also realize that the Palestinians have systematically trained terrorists from Asia and Europe and Africa and Latin America, that they have been very close with to North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba, close ties with Russia and China, and the conclusion by the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrain and Egypt and Jordan and Morocco has been very, very clear. Why would anyone assume that a proposed Palestinian state would deviate from the well-documented, systematic rogue track record, and therefore they have refrained from any walk and any tangible move on behalf of Palestinian state, limiting themselves to very embracing and generous walk. The Saudis and the rest of the pro-American Arab countries are much more in touch with the real Middle East than is the State Department, and they know very well, should there be an independent Palestinian state west of the Jordan River, and in view of the demography of Jordan, the 70% Palestinian majority, the well-entrenched Muslim Brotherhood, the recently intensified Iranian subversion inside Jordan, the destabilizing impact of 1.5 to 2 million Syrian refugees in northern Jordan. Once there is a Palestinian state west of Jordan River, that would mean basically death sentence to the pro-US, relatively moderate Hashemite regime east of the river. And that would transform Jordan into a platform for multitude of Islamic terrorist groups, similar, maybe not identical, but similar to what we currently witness in Libya and Syria and Iraq and South Yemen. It won't limit itself to the boundaries of Jordan. Certainly, there would be a spillover ripple effect southward into the Arabian Peninsula, threatening the survival of every single pro-American, oil-producing Arab regime, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, all the way, I would say, also to Egypt, which would be quite a blow to global trade, realizing the geostrategic location of the Arabian Peninsula, quite a blow to the supply of oil from the Persian Gulf, quite a bonanza to Ayatollahs of Iran, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to Syria, to Russia, to China, and quite a deficit, quite an adverse effect to the American economy, to global terrorism, and particularly to anti-American terrorism, which has extended itself well beyond the Middle East into the US homeland. And that's basically the difference between the State Department on the one hand and the pro-American Arab countries on the other hand, all of whom understand the implication of a proposed Palestinian state, not because they care about the security of Israel, not because they care about Judea, Samaria, which is a cradle of Jewish history and religion and culture and language, because they care about their own survival, which has a direct impact upon dire interest of the United States. And one last comment, the pro-American Arab countries have realized long time ago that the Palestinians do bite the hand that feeds them. They did bite the hand of Egypt and then Syria and then Jordan and then Lebanon and then Kuwait. They have no reason to assume that the Palestinians have reformed themselves. They know that in order to reform, you need a generation, a few generations to rid oneself of the impact of the Palestinian track record, which extends back at least to the 1940s, probably back to the 1920s as well. And by the way, the U.S. should know the tendency by countries, by rogue countries, to bite the hand that feeds them. The U.S. was the one to lend the major assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And the reaction by the Mujahideen was to join the perpetrators of September 11. The US was the one that provided the major tailwind to the Ayatollahs to topple the Shah of Iran, and that transformed Iran from the American policeman of the Gulf to the most venomous octopus, anti-American octopus anywhere in the world. And the same took place in Libya, when the US provided the necessary military help to topple Gaddafi, who was lynched by his adversaries, Islamic terrorists. And what did the Islamic terrorists do? They lynched the American Consul General in Benghazi, in addition to two more diplomats. And the list goes on and on. My last sentence would be, while obviously a Palestinian state in Judea, Samaria, could very well be a death sentence to the Jewish state in the pre-1967 narrow waistline of 8 to 15 miles dominated by the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria, but at the same time, and more importantly, for American target audiences, for American legislators, a Palestinian state would add fuel to the Middle East fire, contrary to America's best interest, would provide tailwind to the Middle East epicenters of anti-American regional and global terrorism, and therefore, the State Department position on the proposed Palestinian state, in my mind, should be scrutinized pretty much along the lines of pro-American Arab countries' behavior, which refrain from advancing such a flawed idea professed by the State Department. And maybe one more comment from my days in Texas. In fact, I'm about to complete another month of briefings and speaking engagements in the US. I spend one more time a week in Texas. And in Texas, there is a saying which applies to the attempt by the State Department against all odds to produce a peacefully coexisting Palestinian state next to the Jewish state. And it has to do with the Texas colloquialism. You can put your boots in the oven, but that don't make them biscuits. Apparently, some people in the State Department establishment assume if they adjust the heat of the oven appropriately, if they try harder, even boots would become biscuits. Well, it doesn't work in Texas. It doesn't work in the Middle East as well.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was incredibly comprehensive. Before we turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Joseph Epstein, I have some questions that have come in. And one is, why aren't these Arab countries able to have any influence over the U.S. State Department if they feel so strongly?
Why don't they have influence?
Why aren't they able to influence the U.S. State Department?
The State Department, in my mind, means well. They mean well, but they're addicted. They're addicted to virtual reality. And when one is addicted, it's very, very difficult to take the addicted person off the drug. And here we're talking a drug of peace, a drug of stability. And we're talking about people who have invested their entire adult life into advancing such a Pollyannish vision, and they don't want to give it up, notwithstanding reality. And reality means, for instance, that the State Department, going back to 1948, has proposed litany plus of different suggestion, different proposal to bring an end, to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every single one was crashed against the rocks of Middle East reality. At the same time, we have 6 peace accords between Israel and Arab countries. Israel, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and South Sudan. We have unprecedented ties, commercial and defense ties with Saudi Arabia. And the only reason these peace accords and the relation with Saudi Arabia have reached fruition is because we have followed a path which is different, contradicts the path undertaken by the State Department. We have decided to bypass the Palestinian issue and subordinate our ties with Arabs to Arab interests, not to Palestinian interests. The State Department has been determined from day one to make the Palestinian issue the centerpiece of the Middle East. They firmly believe, notwithstanding reality, that the Palestinian issue is the crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the crown jewel of Arab policymakers, and a core cause of Middle East turbulence. The fact that none of these assumptions has anything to do with the Middle East. The fact that there are 6 peace accords which have bypassed the Palestinian issue and therefore have come to fruition that has escaped the mind of the State Department, hence the failure of the State Department. And it seems to me that this failure needs to be highlighted from the American point of view, namely, why is such an approach undermining American interest? Why does such an approach threaten the survival of every pro-US Arab regime? And I have no doubt that if one systematically sheds light on the reality, eventually more and more target audiences in the US are going to join the camp of realism over the camp of virtual alternative reality.
Yeah, wonderful. You mentioned also the Iranian presence specifically in the Western Hemisphere and Latin America. Can you delineate that a little bit more? Which countries and how is this a threat to the United States and our national security interests?
We have seen the Ayatollah's regime destabilizing every single pro-American Arab country in the Persian Gulf and throughout the Middle East, but extending their reach to Central Asia, to East, West, and North Africa, in fact, all the way to South and Central America. When it comes to the Middle East, recently their focus has been on Jordan. And the reason that they have focused on Jordan, because they are interested to expand their reach all the way to the Mediterranean. They want to engulf Israel. They want to engulf Saudi Arabia with pro-Iranian regimes. And they have concluded, and rightly so, if they persist in intensifying subversion and terrorism inside Jordan, which would be immensely facilitated by a Palestinian state west of the river, they are going to succeed in toppling the pro-Saudi, the relatively pro-Israel Hashemite regime in Jordan, the pro-US Hashemite regime in Jordan, that would engulf Saudi Arabia from the north by a terrorist arena in the north, namely Jordan, through Iraq and Yemen in the south, which could bring about the toppling of the pro-US Saudi regime in Riyadh. Certainly, it would surround Israel with an Iranian-controlled flank, namely Lebanon and Syria from the north, chaotic Jordan in the east, chaotic non-Hashemite Jordan in the east, and not too far also Saudi Arabia, with the hope of generating instability into Egypt, which would complete the engulfing of Israel, and again, all of which would transform the Middle East into a major anti-American part of the world, and again, critical part of the world between the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Persian Gulf, a critical part of the world to the trade between the Far East and Europe, an arena for major epicenters of anti-American terrorism. And similarly, their actions in Latin America. In Latin America, we have seen the Iranians, especially in the tri-border areas of Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil. They have established in this tri-border area terrorist training camps. Some of the terrorists are dispatched to the Middle East Most of them remain in Latin America with the eyes set on the US mainland. They've done the same thing in the tri-border area of Chile and Peru and Bolivia. They've invested plenty in Venezuela, to which they have provided Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, the same Predator unmanned aerial vehicles which they have provided to the Houthis in Yemen, targeting civilian centers and oil centers in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they have done all that in coordination with Hezbollah, and it goes back to the early 1980s when the Ayatollahs of Iran have teamed up with Hezbollah, investing much in Latin America, which they see as the soft underbelly of the US. Recently, they have intensified their presence, their investment in Mexico, especially with the drug cartels of Mexico, but also drug cartels of Colombia and Bolivia and Ecuador and Brazil. Hezbollah terrorists have been training drug cartels in the so-called art of car bombs and improvised explosive devices. The Ayatollahs have provided drug cartels with sophisticated equipment to construct underground tunnels between Mexico and the USA, attempting to bring into the US not only drugs, but also terrorists. And so far, the State Department, sadly, has been determined not to reassess its diplomatic option towards the Ayatollahs, but they stick to the diplomatic option, refusing to even consider a regime change option, the option of a credible, effective military threat hovering above the head of the Ayatollahs. And the diplomatic option has been in place for the last 45 years, constituting a bonanza for Iran's Ayatollahs. And I would say that the diplomatic option by the State Department towards the Palestinians has been a bonanza towards the Palestinians, because as long as the State Department adheres to a diplomatic option towards the Palestinians unintentionally, and I emphasize unintentionally, they provide an effective tailwind to Palestinian terrorism, because if there is no dramatic cost to Palestinian terrorism, why refrain from terrorism? And as long as the State Department adheres to its own worldview, which, by the way, is especially the worldview of Secretary Tony Blinken and National Security Jake Sullivan, the worldview which suggests that supposedly terrorism is driven by despair, not by ideology, not by fanatic religious vision. As long as that very, very simplistic and faulty and Pollyannish worldview about despair driving terrorism prevails, once again, there is hardly any motivation for either the Ayatollahs or the Palestinians, Palestinian Authority or Hamas, to refrain from terrorism.
There are a lot of wonderful questions that have come in. I want to end on a bit of an optimistic note, and I could predict how you're going to answer this, Yoram, because I've known you for so many years. But my dear friend Ellen Heyman asked, both U.S. parties are culpable in preserving the folly of a Palestinian state. Do you believe that now, after October 7th, that since most Israelis are against it, that the Israeli governments and successive Israeli governments will resist all the pressure from a U.S. administration?
Well, we cannot take anything for granted. Least of all, the assumption that common sense shall prevail. Common sense and State Department policy has been an oxymoron, sadly, and therefore we shouldn't take anything for granted. And those of us who understand, who realize the nature of reality, should not stop sharing facts, especially in my mind with Capitol Hill Democrats and Republicans alike. And when it comes to the chance of influencing Israeli or American policy makers, sadly, wishful thinking is very, very tempting. It will go on for many, many years. And the challenge of educating policymakers, educating public opinion molders is not a sprint. It's a marathon, in my mind, to be realistic. It's a multi-generational marathon, especially when it comes to the State Department. The State Department was the number one brutal opponent of the idea of a Jewish state back in 1948. And the rationale espoused by the State Department was that the founders of the Jewish state originated from East Europe, and therefore the Jewish state was supposed to become an ally of the Soviet bloc, and how wrong they were. The rationale also was that the Jewish state has no military muscles, and therefore they're going to be overwhelmed by the Arab military powers. And again, how wrong they were. And the State Department claimed that the US has to choose either association with the Jewish state or association with Arabs. And once again, we have 6 peace treaties, and the State Department has been wrong again. And therefore, we should not rely on State Department or any other entities reaching the proper conclusion on their own. Anyone who is aware of reality, anyone who is aware of the facts, should not spare efforts to share those facts, and again, especially with House and Senate legislators. Don't underestimate the individual constituents' impact on legislators. There is a myth that legislators do not care about their constituents. Legislators not only care, they're fearful. They're fearful of constituents. And constituents need to leverage the respect or the accountability of legislators towards the constituents by relaying their concerns with the offices in the House and in the Senate. And the vast majority of those legislators, based on my own 35 or so years of experience on Capitol Hill, the vast majority of them are open-minded, Democrats and Republicans alike, and they do appreciate people coming with so-called different music from the one they get from the elite media, different music than they get from official channels. So don't be bashful about sharing your views and facts. It could make a difference.
Okay. Maybe I we have time for one more question. One viewer asked if the Queen of Jordan, who is Palestinian, influential to the king in any consequential way. I mean, there unfortunately has not been very, very good statements coming out of the Queen of Jordan recently, as you know.
Well, again, I reiterate the difference between the talk and the walk. One has to realize that 70% of Jordanians are Palestinians, in addition to strongly entrenched Muslim Brotherhood, in addition to Syrian-driven, Iranian-driven threats to the Hashemite regime. Hence, in a way, the need for the king, his wife definitely, to utter proclamation which may not be consistent with reality, but that's the talk. The main issue is the walk. And once again, I'll resort to the Saudi example. While we do not have peace treaty with Saudi Arabia, the Saudis, especially the Crown Prince MBS, was the major engine which has yielded Israel's peace treaties with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and South Sudan. Saudis did not precondition it upon Israel's accepting a Palestinian state in principle or in reality. The Saudis have developed unprecedented ties with Israel, defense ties, irrigation, agriculture, high technology, and again, never preconditioning it upon Israel's accepting the principle of a Palestinian state. The Saudi foreign minister has been known to refer to a Palestinian state, but that's the talk. Whether we like it or we don't like it, we should not confuse it with the walk. And it seems to me that we should focus on the walk rather than the talk, and educate again Americans about the difference between those two elements, especially in the Middle East and especially among Arabs who have been known in the art of dissimulation.
Right. Okay, we just have a minute. I really want to thank Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is an amazing friend, brilliant, knows American history as well as Jewish history, Israeli history at the tip of his tongue, and is a wonderful strategic asset and ally for all of us. I encourage you to sign up for Yoram's newsletter. Yoram, how do people sign up for your newsletter?
Well, first of all, you can see my articles on my website, which is one word, theettingerreport.com, Ettinger with double T. And those of you who want to get it directly, my email address is yoramtex, YORAMTEX, like Texas, at gmail.com. And I'll be very happy to send you my weekly articles, which are top heavy on facts. They focus on what's in it for America rather than what's in it for Israel, and they do provide facts which you do not get in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times, nor in Fox or on CNN.
Thank you so much, Yoram. And we had the honor and privilege of taking Yoram around Capitol Hill last week. I have to say, all of this costs us a great deal of funds, time, energy. and resources. So if you can, we would really appreciate everyone to donate to Emet and go to emetonline.org. We really do need your donations to keep surviving and keep providing these weekly webinars, our articles, and our weekly and almost daily visits to Capitol Hill. Thank you very much. And we will see you next week with Dr. Waleed Faris. Thank you, Yerim Lehitraot and Nasia Tova to Israel.
Very much. Enjoy.